Royce Barrett, a seasoned drifter, pulled his tired horse to a halt outside Magnolia's Rest, an old, weathered boarding house. The storm was relentless, with sheets of rain hammering down and lightning splitting the dark sky. The door opened before Royce could even knock, and a woman in her 40s stood in the doorway, smiling warmly despite the storm outside. Her name was Maggie, and she introduced herself with a kindness that felt almost too eager. She ushered him inside quickly, away from the rain, and as Royce stepped over the threshold, he couldn't help but feel an odd sense of discomfort. Something in the air was off, but his exhaustion made him ignore it. She was acting strangely, and Royce caught her looking at the back of the house with unease. It didn't escape his attention, but his hunger and fatigue made him dismiss it. Royce had been riding for days, worn down by the harsh conditions, and his body ached from the long journey. His muscles were sore, and the warmth of the fire was making him drowsy. Maggie's forced cheerfulness seemed out of place as she moved around the room, offering Royce a bed for the night. The air felt thick with anticipation something was coming, and Royce could feel it in his bones. And the soft hum of the storm outside were making his eyelids droop. Just as he thought he could finally rest, his body suddenly felt strange, weak, and uncoordinated. His vision blurred, and the world seemed to spin around him. He realized then that the stew had been drugged. His body reacted with a sense of panic, but the drug was too strong, and he found himself unable to move properly. She kept looking out the window, her gaze lingering on the darkness outside, as though waiting for something or someone. The young woman he'd thought was Birdie wasn't a helpless assistant. She was Ruth Caldwell, an undercover U.S. Marshal who had been working to bring down this operation from the inside. There was work to be done, more justice to be served, and more travelers to protect from the dangers hidden in the wilds of the frontier. With Ruth by his side, he knew the road ahead would be a little safer. The truth hit him hard, but before he could act, the men closing in on him shot at him. Royce fought back, managing to take down a few of them. Their conversation was too quiet, but there was a sense of urgency in their tone. The stolen goods, the personal effects of the victims, were recovered, and Maggie was taken into custody. The fire had destroyed much of the evidence, but the truth was now out. What had started as a simple search for shelter had turned into a deadly game of survival. And in the end, Royce had helped Ruth dismantle a dangerous criminal network. Not just any knife, but one with intricate carvings on its handle. He remembered seeing it weeks ago in Silver Creek, carried by a cattle buyer named Morrison, who had never made it to his destination. His heart dropped as he began to piece together the truth. This boarding house wasn't just a refuge. The house was burning, but Royce saw his chance through the smoke. He managed to push open the window and felt the rush of cold air. The fire raged behind him, and the building crumbled, but Royce was determined to make it out alive. It was a trap, a place for travelers to disappear. Royce was too disoriented to make sense of it, but something in his gut told him he was in more danger than he had realized. His heart raced as he realized there were men outside. He was surrounded. Maggie and Birdie weren't just running a boarding house, they were part of a much larger operation. And Royce was now their next victim. Birdie's hands fumbled with the needle, and Royce noticed the young woman's nervousness more clearly now. Royce's mind was clouded by the drug, but he pushed forward, determined to escape. He heard the men below, their voices drifting up through the floorboards, and learned that they weren't just thieves, they were killers. And Royce was about to become their next victim. The storm raged outside, and it seemed like there was no place safer than this boarding house. Little did he know, the danger wasn't from the storm, it was from the very people offering him refuge. A young woman sat by the fire, her blonde hair tied back, hands busy with needlework. She looked up when Royce entered, her wide blue eyes quickly darting away as if avoiding contact. Maggie snapped at her, her tone sharp and uncomfortably authoritarian. The situation felt odd, as if there was something between the two women, something hidden. Birdie quickly pressed her bleeding finger to her lips, nodding quickly and returning to her sewing as though nothing had happened. But Royce was no fool. The tension in the room had grown palpable. He took another spoonful, wincing at the salty taste but pushing through it. He'd been on the trail for days, and this simple meal was a welcome respite from the hardships of the journey. It was to clean for a place that rarely saw visitors. The bed was made with crisp white sheets, the floor swept, and the wash basin gleamed as though it had been recently polished. Royce sat heavily on the bed, exhaustion weighing on him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The room was too perfect, too pristine, for a boarding house that hadn't had many travelers. Maggie introduced her as Bertie, her assistant, and explained that they didn't get many visitors, especially in weather like this. All he wanted was to find shelter for the night, a warm bed and a hot meal. He hung his wet coat by the door and sat down at the small wooden table as Maggie ladled thick, salty stew into a chipped bowl. The warmth of the fire and the promise of dry clothes were too tempting to resist. He was famished, having ridden for hours with no food, and the stew, though unusually salty, was filling. He had no idea that he was about to walk into the middle of something far more sinister. Then a mere storm. The sign hanging crookedly above the porch read Magnolia's Rest, its faded letters barely visible in the dim light. Inside, the small parlor was modest but neat. A fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a warm glow across the room. Royce, too tired to dwell on the odd atmosphere, simply nodded and accepted the offer of food and a bed. As he ate, Maggie asked where he was headed, and Royce mentioned Copper Ridge, where he had work waiting. Bertie, who had returned to her sewing, glanced up at him occasionally, her fingers trembling as she worked. When Maggie made a remark about how hard Royce looked after his long ride, he felt the sting of exhaustion more keenly. As Royce ate, Maggie asked about his journey, speaking with a forced cheerfulness that didn't match the air of quiet tension in the room. It was only when Bertie pricked her finger, a small bead of blood appearing on her pale skin, that the unease in the room fully registered with Royce. The storm continued to rage, wind howling through the building, making the isolation of the boarding house more evident. Maggie led him upstairs to a small room, the second door on the right, she said. He felt his head growing heavy, the warmth of the room, the scent of the stew still lingering. As he stumbled toward the door, the voices of Maggie and Bertie reached his ears from downstairs. Stumbling down the stairs, he saw the glint of metal beneath the bed and knife. Suddenly, the sound of heavy boots on the porch snapped Royce from his thoughts. The storm outside grew fiercer as the house caught fire. The flames spread quickly, trapping him inside. Desperation fueled him as he crawled toward the window, his body betraying him with every movement. Through the smoke and chaos, Royce saw Maggie and Bertie. No, Ruth. He corrected himself, struggling in the distance. In the end, with the boarding house burning around him, Royce and Ruth managed to bring down the operation. As the storm began to clear and the dawn broke over the ruined boarding house, Royce realized that his journey to Copper Ridge could wait.